안녕하세요, 주호입니다. Hello, my name is Juho, and today we'll look at the common misconceptions surrounding particles 는 and 이가. In order to understand these particles properly, we first need to address what is true and what is false. The first misconception is that if a noun is a topic, then it cannot be a subject, when in fact nouns can be both topic and subject at the same time. Some learners assume that because Korean has a topic particle and a subject particle, then a noun must be either topic or subject. But that's not right. We can see this in the fact that subjects, objects, and adverbials can be topics. In the three examples here, Youngi is the subject and Pyeonji is the object for all three sentences. That doesn't change. The topic of each sentence is different, and we have a subject topic, an object topic, and an adverbial topic. Note that the word order changes according to what the sentence topic is. This isn't a feature of particle 는, but rather it's a feature of topic. All of these are possible because topic exists on a higher dimension than subject and object. In the example, 초수는 테니스를 친다, 초수 is the subject and the topic. 초수 is a subject in that this noun has a strong connection to the verb, and 초수 is a topic in that the sentence is about chosu. In UKG-004, we'll talk about the topic comment sentence structure and see why topics exist in a domain above syntax. This is why topic and subject can coincide. In fact, topics are usually subjects, and this is perhaps why people find the two confusing. The next misconception, which is probably the most damaging misconception, is that some people think 는 is a subject particle. It is not a subject particle. Most learners are aware of this fact, but some still see it as a subject particle. When I began researching particles 는 and ga, I looked at how these two particles are being taught, and truth be told, there are some people on blogs, etc., casually calling 는 a subject particle. But worse, there are some so-called teachers who formally teach it as a subject particle. This is simply not true. 는 does not indicate a noun as being a subject. This is evident in the examples we saw previously when 는 occurs with objects and adverbials. Such sentences would not be possible if 는 were a subject particle. Perhaps people think it's okay to call 는 a subject particle because it often occurs with subjects. And in fact, when you look at the most basic sentences which are used in beginner-level textbooks, we see that the subject is normally marked with 는. In the three examples we have here, 초수 is a student, 초수 plays tennis, and 초수 is tall. The subject for all three sentences is 초수, and this noun is normally marked with 는. Only in certain contexts would the subject be marked by ga, so it may seem that 는 indicates subjects, but it doesn't. It's just that topics are usually also subjects. One proof for 는 not being a subject particle is that 는 cannot change the word order of sentences. Since 는 can occur with both subjects and objects, it cannot change the expected SOV word order to OSV. Particles ga and o can do this, but 는 can't. If you ever hear someone call 는 a subject particle, even casually, then tell them that's wrong. The next misconception, which is understandable, is of particle 는 as a topic particle. In another video, I'll demonstrate why this isn't the case. For now, just realize that topic marking is only part of what this particle does. Particle 는 actually has three different effects, and topic marking is but one effect. I won't go into details here because it's explained in UKG-002, but particle 는 has overlapping effects, and some argue that the contrast effect is more basic than the topic marking effect. For 는 to be correctly called a topic particle, topic marking should be the only thing that it does, and that isn't the case. This next misconception, that particle ga is a subject particle, is a big one. In fact, ga is not a subject particle, and this term itself is a simplification from nominative case particle, whatever that means. The term subject particle is a misnomer, and it's very easy to demonstrate why. I have another video on this, UKG-003, so I'll only explain it briefly here with this example. 초수 is not a student. 초수는 학생이 아니다. Now, 초수 here would normally be marked with particle 는, and again, ga can only be used in certain contexts. But for the sake of an example, we will assume such a context and present the sentence 철수가 학생이 아니다. We see here that particle 이가 is used twice, firstly with 철수 and then again with 학생. This sentence does not have two subjects. 철수 is the subject and 학생 is known as a subject complement. 학생 is part of the verb phrase. It co-occurs with the subject, but it itself is not a subject. 철수 is the subject, and yet 철수 is normally marked with particle 는, while something which isn't a subject gets marked with particle 이가. So this example illustrates how the term subject particle is very confusing. What we see here is that the first instance of 이가 is as a subject marker, and the second instance of 이가 is as a complement marker. In fact, in Korean grammar, that is grammar which Korean middle school students learn, these are two different particles. You don't need to know these terms, but the first one means subject case particle, and the second one means complement case particle. Now, I don't agree with this distinction because 이가 really is just the one particle. But the fact that Korean grammar has a non-subject instance of 이가, that itself is a pretty clear indication that subject particle is a misnomer. Now we have the first use 이가, then use 은는 fallacy, which is very common. I myself believed this until I realized I was making so many errors because of it. The fallacy says that when something is brought up for the first time, it's marked with 이가, and when it's mentioned again, it's marked with 은는. The typical example is something like 옛날에 두 형제가 살고 있었다. 두 형제는 시골에 살았다. So here we see in the first sentence, the thing being introduced, the two brothers, is marked by 가. And then in the second sentence, when it's mentioned again, it's marked with 는. However, it's easy to find counterexamples. We can find examples where what is being mentioned previously is marked by 가, and what is mentioned for the first time is marked with 는, as in 내 마음은 호수요. This is the first line from a famous poem. We see that what is introduced for the first time is actually marked by 는. Logically, this means the choice between 는 and 가 is about something else. We need to keep looking for what actually determines the use of these particles. The next misconception is a common internet myth and goes together with the previous fallacy about first using 이가, then using 은는. This myth says that particle 는 is similar to the in English, and 가 is similar to an. This is simply not true. Again, it's easy to find examples which show otherwise, as in 지금 열차가 들어오고 있습니다. Here we see the train is marked by 가. Some might say a train is now approaching is a possible translation, and in some cases it is. However, in the context where someone is standing on the platform, awaiting the train to arrive, the correct translation in that case is the train. This shows that particles 는 and 가 don't match the English articles the and an. Sometimes these particles correlate with the English articles, but this is a result of chance alone. Overall, there's a weak correlation between the two, and it would be a mistake to think the is used here, so I will use particle 는. You'll find yourself making a lot of errors doing that. The problem with this myth is that it ignores what is special about particles 는 and 가. These particles don't act like the English articles, they have another purpose. In order to understand these particles, we need to find what that purpose is. This next misconception that 은는 gives emphasis to what it attaches to has some degree of truth in it. 는 does give some kind of emphasis. However, it will be wrong to assume that this is the emphasis of the sentence. Normally, the opposite is true. In the sentence, 철수 is a student, the most important part of the sentence is 학생이다. This is emphasized over 철수. Why is it so? Because 철수 is normally the least important piece of information in the sentence. In the right context, it can be omitted and carries what we call the lowest degree of purpose. Everyone's recommended to watch UKG-004, which explains what I mean by that. So what does nun do in this sentence? Well, it draws the hearer's attention to chosu. This is some kind of emphasis in itself, but it would be wrong to look at the sentence and think that chosu is the emphasis of the sentence. The emphasis that occurs is actually part of the interaction between speakers. Nun has the purpose of saying, I'm about to say something about chosu now. Do I have your attention? And then after that, 학생이다, that is the important part of the sentence. Now we have a misconception which is fairly common, and that is particle ga supposedly always marks the grammatical subject of the sentence. However, that isn't true. As we've seen previously, particle ga occurs with non-subjects and does not always mark the subject of the sentence. In the sentence cho수는 학생이 아니다, 학생 is not the subject, cho수 is. And again, cho수 is normally marked with nun, while a non-subject, complement, is marked with iga. Another example of this is where ga is used for emphatic effects, as in 나비는 예쁘지가 않다, where ga has the effect of emphasizing beautiful. Butterflies is the subject, and again, ga is used for a purpose other than subject marking. Some people have said that subjects of embedded clauses are always marked with iga. This point is more difficult, and you can see the blue belt used to show that this is for intermediate level learners. First, we need to understand what an embedded clause is. So here we have the sentence 나는 엄마가 돌아오기를 기다렸다. I waited for mum to return, which is made up of two clauses. The first clause, the outer clause, is I waited for X, and the second clause, the inner clause, mum to return. The subject of the inner clause is mum. You can perhaps see that mum to return is being substituted into the main clause. It's essentially acting as X in I waited for X. X is a noun, so the clause mum to return performs as a noun in the main clause. And what do you know? This is called an embedded noun clause. You can also see that the embedded clause plays the role of object in the sentence. So, don't we love particles? Some people have said that subjects of embedded clauses are always marked with iga, and as we see, mum is indeed an embedded subject marked with ga. However, that isn't always the case. You can, at the right time, mark embedded subjects with nun. If the embedded subject is contrasted with something, then you always use particle nun. The rule should be that subjects of embedded clauses are normally marked with iga unless contrastive. There's an asterisk attached because there's an exception to this rule. When the embedded clause is a quotation, either direct or indirect, then things are different. Another misconception is that if a noun can be removed and the sentence still makes sense, then you should use particle nun. In a way, this rule does have some merit. If you look at the sentence, chosu is a student, it is sometimes possible to remove chosu. Chosu is normally the least important part of the sentence, and for that reason, it can sometimes be removed. If we already know we're talking about chosu, the noun can be removed and the sentence still makes sense. So it may seem that we can follow this rule. However, there are some problems with this. Firstly, it's important to note that there are times when a nun-marked noun cannot be removed. If nun is being used for its contrast effect, that is, chosu was being contrasted with someone else, then neither particle nun nor the noun can be removed. Moreover, there are many reasons why nouns can be removed, and nun isn't used in every case. Take, for example, if you're walking up a hill in the heat of summer and suddenly feel a cool breeze, here the correct particle upon wind is iga, and yet the noun can be removed. You could simply say 시원하다. When to omit things is highly nuanced. We won't talk about that other than to say that things are omitted for reasons other than why particle nun is used. And so the rule in question doesn't always work. This next misconception pops up every now and then when people say particle nun replaces particle ga, but that doesn't really happen. Perhaps this comes from the idea that subjects are normally marked with ga, but that isn't the case. If we're looking at complex sentences such as I waited for mum to return, then the embedded subjects are normally marked with ga unless contrastive, and in that case it does seem that nun replaces ga. However, that isn't the case for main clauses, and that isn't what happens with the most basic sentences. If we look again at these examples, Chosu is a student, Chosu plays tennis, and Chosu is tall. For each sentence, the subject is Chosu, and this noun is normally marked with particle nun. Only in certain contexts would ga be used. When we look at the most basic sentences, particle ga isn't used by default. And in fact, if there were no particle, the sentence would be interpreted as being similar to using particle nun. So here we have an alternative way to translate the sentences, and the purpose of this is to show how, when there is no context, we interpret the sentence depending on the particle used. 1 says, Chosu, he's a student. 2 says the same thing. It's essentially the same. However, when the sentence uses Chosu ga, then it's now a different sentence. Now it's like saying, it is Chosu who is a student. Again, these translations are used to show the kind of effect each sentence has, and we see that sentence 3 is very different from the first two. Now, of course, language doesn't exist in a vacuum, so there's always some context. But if we see the sentence Chosu is a student as an example sentence in a book, or for some reason we look up to the sky and see it written in the clouds, then it would be either sentence 1 or 2. Sentence 3 would only be used with background context. And what does this mean? Well, this tells us that particle ga isn't the default particle for subjects, but rather, in cases like this, it's actually particle ga which seemingly replaces nun. However, that isn't really happening because the default is to have no particle. The final misconception is about omitting these particles. For some reason, people casually say that you can omit them and it isn't a big deal. Some have even gone so far as to recommend omitting them when you're unsure of which one to use. But this is dangerous. Knowing when to omit particles is highly nuanced. I think that knowing when to omit particles is more difficult than choosing between nun or ga. Sometimes you can omit them, but sometimes you can't and shouldn't. It's easiest to know when particles must be used. In the case of particle nun, it cannot be omitted when denoting contrast, emphasis, or when shifting between topics. In the case of particle ga, it cannot be omitted when giving particular focus or emphasis to something, or when there's subject ambiguity. So to encourage anyone to omit these particles, saying that it sounds more natural, that's a bad idea. If you omit particles too often, or when you shouldn't, it would only make you sound like a child. That being said, sometimes using a particle rather than omitting it can also be inappropriate. Knowing when to use and when to omit particles is very difficult. It's a mistake to think that you can freely omit them, and doing so only makes you sound more native-like. That only works if you know the rules and the nuances, which are very difficult to define. So these are the biggest and most common misconceptions surrounding particles nun and ga. Have you heard contradicting statements about when to use them? How many of these misconceptions have you heard? Here are some other fallacies which didn't make the cut. I hope this video has been helpful.